of tax-exempt organizations that receive generous benefits under Section 501 of the U.S. Tax Code engaging in activities that may not be in line with the spirit or the letter of the law. Our investigation into this issue ranges from the anti-Semitic activities and harassment of Jewish students we see occurring on college campuses today, to the nexus between tax-exempt organizations and terrorism, to concerns over the level of community benefit being provided by tax-exempt non-profit hospitals, to the undue influence of foreign money in U.S. elections and domestic policy debates. Today, we are considering 5 pieces of legislation to address those concerns as well as correct a deficiency in our current laws about the illegal disclosure of taxpayer information. The first bill we will consider, introduced by Congressman Smucker, requires tax-exempt organizations to provide information on grants they make to foreign entities. This bill brings transparency to tax-advantaged money flowing overseas by requiring the same reporting that is already required for funds nonprofits provide to domestic entities. We know from the oversight work by the Select Committee on the Coronavirus Pandemic, chaired by Dr. Winstrup, that a 501c3 by the name of EcoHealth Alliance received funds and then turned around and gave grants to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China that was conducting gain-of-function research. Bringing transparency to where their money is going will help prevent donors and the American people from being duped into funding causes they simply do not support. The next bill, introduced by Congresswoman Tinney, will do much to shore up the integrity of our elections by preventing tax-exempt organizations from funneling donations to state and local election organizations. The End Zuckerbucks Act is aptly named because it was inspired by the actions of a wealthy billionaire who donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charitable organizations that funded state and local election organizations in a way that appears to have benefited one political party over another. In fact, in several states, the majority of the grant funding went to counties won by President Biden. I doubt that that was a coincidence. Our third bill, introduced by Congressman Schweikert, will help shine a light on the influx of foreign funding into tax-exempt organizations. Americans deserve to know whether the political or policy ads that are blanketing our airwaves are funded by foreign governments or actual American grassroots. Mr. Schweikert's bill requires tax-exempt organizations receiving foreign donations to disclose general data on the amount, frequency, and source country of such donations. There are reports of a tax-exempt organization by the name of the Energy Foundation that claims to be US-based, but which appears to have operations primarily in China and is run by the former Deputy Director General of China's National Center for Climate Change Strategy. The group has spent millions promoting green energy policies that would make the US more dependent on Chinese resources. This legislation also maintains critical privacy protections for Americans wishing to donate to a cause of their choice. Federal agencies should not be in the business of writing regulations demanding that tax-exempt organizations abide by disclosure requirements that Congress has not enacted into law. The fourth bill, introduced by Congresswoman Malliotakis, closes a loophole in the tax code that allows foreign nationals to funnel funds to influence U.S. elections. While foreign nationals are prohibited from making contributions in connection with any election, there is nothing that currently prohibits overseas funds from flowing through tax-exempt organizations and into the hands of political committees like super PACs. In the most disturbing example that the committee has come across, a foreign national from Switzerland has given hundreds of millions of dollars to fund left-wing groups that are connected to Arabella Advisors, a consulting group that has been described by the New York Times as the leading vehicle for dark money on the left. The funds sent by this foreign national were ultimately sent to super PACs during the 2020 election cycle that backed Democrats or opposed Republicans. This bill penalizes any tax-exempt organization that receives foreign contributions and then donates to political committees, and includes language that would revoke their tax-exempt status entirely should the organization continue to violate these new prohibitions. Lastly, we will consider the Taxpayer Data Protection Act to help deter the unauthorized disclosure of confidential taxpayer information after it was discovered that an IRS contractor stole and unlawfully disclosed the tax information of thousands of Americans, believed to be over 70,000 Americans, including President Trump. To the New York Times and ProPublica, the Department of Justice charged the contractor with just a single count of violating the prohibition against such disclosure. He was ultimately sentenced to just 5 years in prison, which is the maximum penalty allowed under existing law. This bill increases that maximum penalty to 10 years in prison, increases the potential fine up to $250,000, and clarifies that each individual taxpayer whose information is stolen represents a distinct instance of unauthorized disclosure. The committee's work today will help protect the integrity of our political and policy debates, bring transparency to how tax-exempt organizations operate, especially those which accept foreign dollars, and send a strong message to would-be criminals that confidential taxpayer information should remain just that, confidential. I'm now pleased to recognize the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Chairman. The Democrats on this committee are delighted to engage the argument about campaign finance, including the fact that Joe Biden won the last presidential election. We think that the argument this morning ought to start with that supposition. We are disturbed as well by the clear distortions that have come about the result of that election. We find ourselves still on the Republican road that tends frequently to go nowhere for the American people. And based on what we are currently witnessing, the sky apparently is the limit for these distortions. Our committee has reported out 30 bills, 2 have become law. Contrast that with what happened in the 116th and 117th Congress. I am pleased to report this morning, though, we seem to have gotten off at the Ways and Means Committee the argument that we have responsibility in impeachment proceedings. Now, as we watch digging even deeper into the service of the former nominee of the Republican Party, the outcome of the last presidential election is ample for us to debate this morning. As people stormed the Capitol, apparently you can turn a blind eye to election results. It seems these days that there's nothing that our opposition won't do to talk about the distortions of the last presidential election as to who actually won the election. Now, we all agree that taxpayers must have the fullest confidence in the IRS and its employees, that their information is safe and protected, and that if you commit a crime, you can and should be held accountable. That's why we made historic investments in the Inflation Reduction Act. Our colleagues have attempted to hamper out our progress and turn it into a real achievement. We passed the Presidential Tax Filings and Audit Transparency Act of 2022. This team's going to come a lot this morning. We want to pick and choose based upon the whims of the last presidential election. Another bill under consideration today is a real departure from the norm. In others, it's the same old grit that we have come to expect. Our colleagues are attempting to crack down on private investment that enhanced and secured our last presidential election in the middle of a once-in-a-generation global pandemic because they frequently disagree with outcomes. Every state benefited in some measure from those efforts to upgrade electioneering systems. This investment was already unanimously cleared by the Federal Election Commission after finding no reason to believe there was any wrongdoing. Rather, private citizens who recognized the immense financial strain and infrastructure challenges that cropped up in administering the 2020 election in the middle of a global pandemic decided that we should do something about it. Even though the president at the time refused to acknowledge this great need, local officials were begging for assistance. Our Republican colleagues on the committee refused to act even as hometown officials accepted the money. This comes from a party that has pushed for privatization when it serves their interests, that wants to ban it in other outright opportunities. We've heard individuals in the United States Senate, two prominent Republicans, say they're okay with privatizing Medicare and Social Security. Election security isn't political. We all on this committee have felt to be victimized by dark money. We should be addressing that. Everybody has witnessed it on one side of this committee or the other. The most sacred tenet of our democracy is fair, free elections where we accept the outcome. Putting doubts in the American people's minds about distortions and disinformation and even fraud is not helpful to the political conversation. In Buckley versus Vallejo, it was well stated, sunlight should be the best disinfectant as it relates to election financing. Those who have received support should be able to report it and accept the disclosure that we on our side are entirely in favor of. When voting rights are under attack, the American people should be able to look at their elected officials as honest actors and put the best interest of the country first. Most of this legislation this morning falls far short of that standard. Let me yield back my time.
Our first order of business is H.R. 8290, the Foreign Grant Reporting Act, introduced by Representative Smucker. Right now, tax-exempt organizations have to disclose the grants that they make to entities here in the United States, but they do not have to publicly disclose the grants they make to foreign entities. Representative Smucker's bill will close that loophole and bring greater transparency to the system so Americans can know what activities their charitable donations are funding, either at home or abroad. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's markup. I'd like to thank you for your leadership in bringing these 5 pieces of legislation for our consideration today, the leadership of Oversight Subcommittee Chairman Schweikert as well. These bills will shed light on foreign financial influence over U.S. elections and domestic policy. This is in the context of the growth that we've seen in the tax-exempt sector. According to the IRS, in 2022, there were 1.48 million and a half tax-exempt organizations. That's 271% higher than 3 decades prior, when there were only about 500,000. According to the Census Bureau, nonprofit employment has increased by 33% compared to private sector job growth of an increase of 9% over the past 15 years. Now, certainly, we're not against nonprofit organizations, but there should be transparency around how they spend dollars. And this is specifically the focus of the legislation I introduced, the Foreign Grant Reporting Act. And I think it can best be summarized in 2 words, transparency and parity. Let's start with transparency. When this committee met late last year to discuss how foreign money can influence U.S. elections and domestic policy, we discovered the lack of transparency when it comes to how tax-exempt organizations receive money from foreign entities, and then specifically, which this bill addresses, also how they send money out to foreign entities. We learned that U.S. tax-exempt organizations are not required to disclose grants they send to foreign entities. Why does that matter? Since the horrific October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel, we've seen a surge of anti-Semitic and anti-American protests in cities and on college campuses. Tax-exempt organizations such as the National Students for Justice in Palestine and American Muslim for Peace are currently under investigation for possibly providing material support to Hamas, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization. These tax-exempt entities can take advantage of this loophole in the tax code, which doesn't require 501(c)s to disclose grants they provide to foreign entities. Since these tax-exempt entities aren't required to disclose this information about grants, we have little transparency into if these grants may end up supporting terrorists or other malicious actions intentionally or perhaps indirectly. When tax-exempt sector provides grants to domestic entities, in contrast, they're already required to disclose information about the recipients in their annual tax filings. And that's, we get to the parity in this legislation. The Foreign Grant Reporting Act will require 501c organizations to include basic information about the grants they provide to foreign entities in their annual tax filings. That includes the name and address of the foreign entity, the aggregate amount provided to that foreign entity during the tax year, and also if a foreign entity receiving the grants are indeed charities. This is the same information that 501c organizations already must provide about grants they give to domestic entities. So by bringing parity to reporting requirements between foreign and domestic grants, this legislation will bring greater transparency into money leaving the U.S. and hold tax-exempt organizations accountable to their donors and to the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for considering this legislation, and I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. Tax-exempt organizations play a vital role in our communities. Indeed, they touch every corner, from education to the arts to medical research to social services. These organizations frequently step up to fill unmet needs and work toward the common good. We are all in favor on our side of transparency. It is reasonable to expect that that transparency will be offered around grant making that is given to tax status. Foreign and domestic grant reporting requirements should be the same. While I have a degree of skepticism about what's happening this morning, I must say that it is our position on this piece of legislation to support the act.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 8290, the Foreign Grant Reporting Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Neal, the members have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 15 and JCX 20, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a couple of clerical corrections to the underlying legislation. The underlying legislation starts from the present law premise that organizations do report foreign activities on their Form 990s. But the introduced bill provides that if an organization is required on Form 990 to provide information on grants or assistance to a foreign organization, that it also include the name and address of the recipient organization, the aggregate amount of the grants provided, and the classification of the recipient organization. Is it recognized as a foreign charity? Is it recognized as a foreign charity under 501c3, a supporting organization, or the like? This legislation would be effective for returns for Form 990s filed in taxable years beginning after the date of enactment. My colleagues on the Joint Committee staff have estimated that this would have a negligible budgetary effect over the fiscal 2024 through 2034 budget period. That concludes my brief description. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barhold, I have some concerns about specific one area of ambiguity in the bill, and that's with respect to defining what an indirect contribution to foreign entities would look like. Is the term defined in the bill itself?
Mr. Snyder, the legislation says providing direct or indirect and does not define indirect. In determination of an indirect recipient would really be a facts and circumstance investigation.
Would there be any advantage in enhancing compliance, making it easier for tax filers to report if we had a definition in the bill?
As I noted, indirect would require a facts and circumstance determination, so anything that you might do in terms of report language or change in the statutory language that provides some additional indication of what might be included in indirect should be helpful both to tax administrators and to the organizations themselves.
All right, thank you. I will add an amendment when we get to that point. I yield back.
Are there additional technical questions? Seeing none, we will move to strike the last word. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Winstrup is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. As many of you may know, I chair the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. We've been investigating all aspects of the pandemic for the last 18 months. And one of the key findings has been the really reckless lack of oversight of U.S. government funding that was directed towards, in this case, gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. And we know that a grant from NIAID, given to EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit tax-exempt organization, was funneled to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to perform this dangerous research. What's surprising and shocking is that the NIH does not have adequate procedures to monitor these sub-grant recipients and ensure that federal funds are subject to rigorous biosafety and biosecurity requirements, especially when you're going to a foreign country that's actually an adversary. Dr. Fauci shared with us through this process that when the grant is submitted, it goes to an advisory board, and once they approve it, his only job is to sign it, not necessarily read it or have much oversight on it. When we asked about the notion that they weren't complying with the regulations and rules of the grant, he said, well, that's over in compliance, and he didn't have anything to do with that. So the point being is, we really need to have greater awareness of what is going on, especially when U.S. taxpayer dollars are going to a foreign entity. In that particular case, I've issued 8 recommended improvements to the NIH and NIAID procedures. I'm pleased to see that Ways and Means is taking a separate step today that will help increase transparency over these subgrants given by U.S.-based tax-exempt organizations to foreign entities. Requiring tax-exempt organizations to report the name and address of a foreign entity and the amount of the grant will ensure that next time we will know if U.S.-based organizations are engaged with possibly dangerous foreign entities like the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So I support these common sense transparency requirements. I hope that all members of this committee can do so on a bipartisan basis, and I think even going forward, we may consider when we are granting money to a foreign entity that those that are involved with the grant process at some point get a briefing from the intelligence community as to the risks that may be presented there. And I think that's something that we should work on as well on our side here at Ways and Means. And with that, I yield back.
Strike the last word, Mike.
Mr. Thompson's recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful to learn that finally, after decades of push from our side of the aisle, the Republican Party has decided to be concerned about money in politics and foreign interference in American elections. This is great news. Some of the bills before us today make sense, and I look forward to supporting them. Others, I think, are conspiracy-based, overbroad, and I believe that they're going to have unintended consequences. I'll be voting no on those. But I do want to make sure we get on the record. Every single Democrat on this committee has voted multiple times to get money out of politics. Some of us have voted to do this dozens of times, and every time we've been blocked by Republicans in Congress and on the Supreme Court. I struggle to understand the logic by which Republicans are extremely concerned about Mark Zuckerberg donating masks and COVID tests to election workers, but completely not concerned about Citizens United and the underlying role of dark money in our politics. So I would just say, in light of some of the issues the majority has raised today, my Republican colleagues might consider the reflective opposition to some of the proposals our side of the aisle has put forward to improve transparency and reduce the influence of money in our politics. Thank you, and I yield back.
Additional members wish to strike the last word. Ms. Malliotakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleague for bringing this bill because it is something that we've discussed at great length, particularly Congressman Wenstrup and myself, who both are on the COVID Select Subcommittee. The amount of American money, American tax dollars that are going to foreign entity to conduct particular experiments. And we need transparency. We need to know if we are giving a grant to a particular organization within the United States and they are sub-granting those American tax dollars to another organization, we need to know who and why and what is the goal of this. Because since March of 2020, the EcoHealth Alliance, who I believe should not receive another penny from American tax dollars, has virus research projects that are being funded with countries that we are concerned about, that they have subpar safety conditions, number one. But this will bring transparency so we know who these organizations are working with, and we can crack down on that money if necessary. So for example, since March 2020, EcoHealth Alliance, that has received funding, is working further with China on bat coronaviruses. They are doing bat research in the Philippines, in Laos, in Myanmar, all coronaviruses, Liberia, Vietnam. They are working on the Nipah virus in Bangladesh, zoonotic viruses in Thailand and Singapore, Malaysia. And in fact, they are working with foreign entities to bring bats here to the United States to create a colony at Colorado State University, which, by the way, has also had issues with lab leaks. So while we want to support science and research, we also need to make sure that we are not hurting ourselves by funding a project that could potentially produce the next pandemic. And that this is really instrumental in making sure we can follow the money and ensure that NIH is funding projects that are truly worthy and safe and have a true scientific reason behind it. And so I support this legislation and yield back.
Additional members wish to strike the last word. Mr. Larson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also thank the sponsors of this legislation and associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Neal and Mr. Thompson as well. There's part of me, the more cynical part, that wishes we'd break into the theme from our charade, because I do think the authors of the bill are both well-intended and focused in what they want to do, but in the same breath, here we are all understanding what we need to do to strengthen the election process coming forward. This will be the most scrutinized presidential election in the history of the country. I just hope our colleagues on the other side will be prepared when the winner is announced to support the winner and not to end up in protest at the United States Capitol and what we witnessed on January the 6th. And the way to guarantee that is to make sure that our local election officials and entities are funded instead of cutting money from these critical programs that will guarantee this. What we need to do is enhance it so that every voter has the right to turn out, and everybody from the local media on up guarantees that the elections were held and were monitored and the results will be honored. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Additional members wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, we will move to amendments. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
A point of order has been reserved. Will the gentleman suspend while the amendment is distributed?
Yes.
Proceed, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. As Louis Brandeis famously said and noted earlier, sunlight is the best of disinfectants. And I suspect every one of us on this committee agrees with that view. And in a nod to my friend Dr. Wenstrup, I'll quote Hippocrates, who said the chief virtue of language is a chief virtue that language can have is clarity. And with that in mind, I'd like to try to help make this bill, this piece of legislation, more clear. Uncertainty in what is and what is not required to be reported on tax returns does not achieve the transparency that I believe this bill is aiming to accomplish. These definitions should be clear so that tax-exempt organizations know exactly what is required, both so that they are in compliance, but also so that this important information can be disclosed. Lack of clarity in the requirement risks encompassing a far broader than intended universe of grant aid. It runs the risk that donors might be considered to have provided indirect funding as a result of a subsequent donation to another charity. The amendment I'm offering today would insert a definition of the purposes of this reporting requirement to provide clarity. It would ensure that only grants explicitly or impliedly allocated to a foreign entity for the ultimate use of the foreign entity are treated as contributions made indirectly. Mr. Chairman, I support this bill's aim to increase transparency and disclosure, and my amendment will further advance these goals that I believe we all share and ensure that there is clarity. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank my friend, Mr. Schneider, for introducing this amendment. And I understand the intent of the amendment is if a contribution is given or a grant is given to an organization and then that organization uses it inadvertently or in a way that does not comply, that the contributing reporting agency should not be held liable or should not be culpable in that situation. I understand the concern. I appreciate Mr. Schneider's support of the intent of this bill is for more transparency. I would be concerned that it would be very easy then to direct money to a secondary organization to be used as they wish. And so it could potentially be a way to circumvent the new legislation that is going into place. However, I certainly would be willing to consider options here without seeing initially or without seeing prior to this the language and fully understanding the impact of it. I'm going to recommend a no today. But again, I fully understand the intent here, and if there's a way that this can be addressed going forward, I'd be happy to work with Mr. Schneider on that going forward.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Schneider. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan?
No.
Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska, no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. LaHood? Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, no. Mr. Arrington? Dr. Ferguson? Mr. Estes?
No.
Mr. Estes, no. Mr. Smucker?
No.
Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn, no. Mrs. Miller? Dr. Murphy? Dr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kustoff? Mr. Kustoff, no. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick, no. Mr. Stubbe? Ms. Tinney? Ms. Tinney, no. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore, no. Mrs. Steele? Mrs. Steele, no. Ms. Van Dyne? Ms. Van Dyne, no. Mr. Feenstra? Mr. Feenstra, no. Ms. Maliotakis? Ms. Maliotakis, no. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Davis? Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer? Mr. Evans? Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez, yes. Mr. LaHood? Mr. Arrington? Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson, no. Mrs. Miller? Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Davis? Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans? Chairman Smith?
No.
Chairman Smith, no.
How is Mr. Stubbe recorded?
Mr. Stubbe is not recorded. Mr. Stubbe, no.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 15, the noes are 22.
There being 15 ayes and 22 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 8290 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 8290 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Davis. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mrs. Miller. Mr. Davis. Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Evans. Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 38. The noes are 0.
There being 38 ayes and 0 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 8290 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 8290 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 8291, the End Zuckerbucks Act introduced by Representative Tinney. Wealthy donors should not be allowed to funnel millions of dollars or any sum of money through tax-exempt organizations to directly fund official election entities and activities. And yet that's exactly what we saw happen in 2020 when one wealthy billionaire used 501c3 organizations to launder hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for Democrat-run cities and counties to support election administration. This bill prohibits that activity and would restore some integrity to our electoral process. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's markup and for including my bill 8291, the End Zuckerbucks Act, as part of this markup. For those of you who are not familiar, I serve as the co-chair of the House Election Integrity Caucus, the only one of its kind in Congress. Our caucus currently has over 70 members focused on driving common sense solutions to ensure fairness in the democratic process and improve the administration of elections. We have numerous policy priorities, and that includes my bill, the End Zuckerbucks Act, which would prevent 501c3s from providing funding to state and local elections. In the 2020 election, Mark Zuckerberg, the famous Facebook CEO, under the guise of an organization called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, a left-wing nonprofit group, flooded left-leaning county governments in Texas, Ohio, Nevada, Minnesota, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin, and even my own state of New York, Pennsylvania, with opaque private funding to influence election administration for their own purposes. And let me just stress, I heard some of the ranking member and other Democrats refer to this as, helping out with this horrible pandemic election. Well, the facts are that in 2020, Governor Cuomo was the governor of New York. They changed election law over 100 times during the pandemic election, and not once did they increase funding or assist the local governments in trying to administer elections. And this is what caused so many of the problems, not just in New York, but throughout the country. And CTCL, or the Center for Tech and Civic Life, uses this money as a leverage over these cash-strapped election agencies, forcing them into advancing its own partisan agenda. And when the chairman talks about hundreds of millions, it was $419 million from Zuckerberg that was flooded to field under the guise of making voting safer amid the pandemic. Yet here's the rub. 1% of those funds were spent on PPE, just 1%. 92% went to left-leaning districts that were aiming to actually try to sway the election. Since then, CTCL has been using its subsidiary organization, the Alliance for Election Excellence, to provide heavily discounted services to certain jurisdictions. This includes in-depth consulting services that can help shape the voting processes without Democrat input from residents. Without my bill, the End Zuckerbucks Act, left-wing groups will continue trying to unfairly influence the election process, and voters shall ultimately have the say. And part of the problem is it makes it so impossible, especially during this pandemic election, for these boards to actually carry out their role to ensure that we have fair elections and to preserve election integrity, which is the mission of all of these groups. And I just want to mention just a couple things about the Center for Tech and Civic Life and some of the references made by Republicans being concerned about what happens in our elections. The Democrats made objections to election results in 2001, 2005, 2017, after the losing candidate had already conceded the race. Interestingly, in a very partisan way, the Democrats did not object to 2009 or 2013 on the floor of the House of Representatives. And it's important to note that these have become very partisan exercises. But I think if we pass my bill, we will let the voters know that we will preserve the most profound expression of self-governance, and that is our sacred right to vote in a fair and private election. This is how we're going to preserve our elections. This is how we're going to keep private money, partisan money out of elections, whether it's left or right. And I want to make sure that we do preserve election integrity in this very controversial and obviously very contentious election upcoming right now. And so if we pass my bill and we clean elections up and we make sure that elections aren't partisan, we make sure that private players aren't interfering with proper government action, we will make voting great again. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We accept the sincerity, certainly, of the gentlelady's intentions here, but also it would be helpful if we had a full recognition from Republicans across the country as to who won the last presidential election. With that, let me yield my time to the gentlelady from Alabama who really knows something about the integrity of elections and has spent a career working on voter integrity and opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Along with serving on the House Ways and Means Committee, I currently also sit on the Committee on House Administration, where I serve as the ranking member of the Election Subcommittee. I'm also the proud author of the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which seeks to fully restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As many of you know, I represent my hometown of Selma, Alabama, where brave foot soldiers like our former and late and great colleague here on Ways and Means, John Lewis, and others were beaten on a bridge for the equal right of all Americans to vote. I care deeply about the responsibilities that we, as members of Congress, have to ensure our elections are secure and accessible. However, elections cannot be secure and accessible if they're not properly funded. It saddens me that both House Administration and now today the House Ways and Means Committee have chosen to pursue this legislation which will suppress get-out-the-vote efforts instead of focusing on sound legislation that will properly fund our elections and expand access to the ballot box. The consequences of not passing sound policy that aims to alleviate communities of the lack of adequate resources in order to make sure that our election integrity is secure. We see long lines, polling station changes, and ballot shortages that have apparently been ignored for far too long. Too often, these consequences disproportionately impact minority communities. It is time that we address the funding gap by, instead of using our power in Congress to provide robust public funding to ensure that election workers have what they need to adequately run elections and protect election workers and safeguard our democracy. That is what we should be doing today. When Republicans decide to join Democrats in adequately funding safe and accessible elections for all Americans, I'll be open to considering proposals of eliminating private funding. I look forward to working with Representative Tenney on actually trying to close the gap on funding. Congress cannot take steps to provide assistance every once in a while. We have the responsibility to adequately and equitably fund elections every election cycle. Today's bill is a distraction from the real issue facing voters. From fake robocalls funded by conservative operatives like Elon Musk spreading election misinformation on his platform, to right-wing interests seem hell-bent on keeping the American people away from the ballot box. Again, I would gladly work with my Republican colleagues on addressing the real issue here, which is adequate public funding of elections. I will be voting no on this legislation, and I urge my Republican colleagues to help support public funding of elections and also support restoring the full protections of the Voting Rights Act by voting in favor of and allowing to come to the floor the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 8291, the End Zuckerbucks Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentations.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, the members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 16 and JCX 21, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute. The chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, makes some clerical corrections to errors in the underlying legislation. The underlying legislation itself starts from the present law premise that 501c3 organizations are prohibited from engaging in political campaign intervention. However, certain activities such as get-out-the-vote drives or candidate forums are not considered campaign intervention if conducted in a nonpartisan manner. The introduced legislation amends 501c3 to provide that an organization will not qualify for exemption as a 501c3 organization if it provides any or direct funding to a state or local governmental unit for use in administration of elections for public office. That does not impact the ability of exempt organizations to donate physical space for use as a polling location. This legislation would be effective for taxable years beginning after 2024, and the Joint Committee staff has estimated that it would have a modest effect of raising in the neighborhood of $500,000 in federal receipts over the fiscal 2024 through 2034 budget period. That concludes my brief description of the legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. It's very clear that Mr. Zuckerbuck just wanted to favor one side over the other and using his money to do this. I just wondered, does our current law require any 501c3 organizations that provide funding state, local governments for election administration purposes to do this equally? Do it equally across the states, the counties, localities in different regions of the country? Or under current law, are they just able to target their donations and do it to areas where they would like to have political influence?
Sir, I'm not aware that there's any requirement that that contributions to state and local governments be made in a uniform manner.
Yeah, I would just say this, we don't want the money in politics on the billionaires on either side of this political scheme to have anything, and so, or to have such influence that they have just because they have money, and so thank you for the question. Yield back.
Ms. Sewell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartol, the Republican colleagues have made these absurd claims that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife rigged the 2020 elections by donating money to 501c3 organizations such as the Center for Tech and Civic Life and the Center for Election Innovation and Research. These claims are false. These organizations dispatch grants to local governments in both blue and red states to assist with election administration and provided grants to all who applied. However, numerous complaints were filed alleging that Zuckerberg and these organizations violated campaign finance law. This all comes after the Federal Election Committee, in a unanimous bipartisan 6-0 decision, found that the organizations and the Zuckerbergs did not violate campaign finance law. The FEC confirmed that the donations were apolitical, that grants were widely awarded across jurisdictions, and that the nexus between the donations and any purpose to influence the 2020 election was speculative at best. Mr. Bartol, under current law, can a 501c3 organization provide grants to a state or local government to help aid election administration for public office?
Yes, Ms. Sewell, there's no prohibition of that sort.
And in fact, you said that as long as it was done so in an apolitical way, that this was totally legal and compliant with the law.
Under present law, such things as get out the vote drives, for example, as long as administered in a nonpartisan fashion, are completely legitimate.
Yeah. In fact, I find it ironic that my colleagues think it's okay for churches to get involved in election administration, but somehow 501c3s that are doing it in totally apolitical ways are not. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit into the record a Washington Post dated article September 8th, 2022, entitled FEC Unanimously Rejects Complaints About Zuckerberg's 2020 Election Grants.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Moore is recognized for technical questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartol, I was wondering whether or not Mr. Zuckerberg, these donations had any foreign donors. Is that what this bill presumes?
Ms. Moore, this legislation before you has no specific reference to the source of donations.
Okay, I mean, Mr. Zuckerberg himself is an American citizen, is that right?
I believe that's correct, Ms. Moore.
Okay. So were there any issues raised with regard to disclosure? Did we actually know who Mr. Zuckerberg was when he was making these donations? Or is there some sense that he used some other identity to make these disclosures? Was there a secret about who made these donations?
Further technical questions?
I'm asking.
Pardon me for the delay, Ms. Moore. I don't have a complete answer. It is possible on the 501c3 organizations Form 990 that the recipients of grants, which would have been domestic in this case, would have been identified.
Would have been identified.
Would have been identified on the form.
So when we're considering this bill, and we have numbers of bills that raise concerns about dark money, we couldn't actually call this dark money since we know who donated it. Is there anything in this bill that suggests that the donations to cities and counties and states were given, that they were used in any way to promote partisan material, commercials, anything, candidates' names, vote for? Or is there anything in this legislation that suggests that these funds were used for those purposes, for anything other than infrastructure?
Ms. Moore, this legislation isn't about past elections. It's just on a prospective basis saying that any funding, any direct funding to a state or local government for use in administration of elections could disqualify the organization from 501c3 status.
And 501c3 status, you get that because you're doing something charitable. Is that right?
Generally so, charitable, educational.
I think I'm going to yield at some point to Ms. Tenney, because she talked about the fact in New York, a place where it's often cash-strapped and has no monies, and there was a pandemic, and New York did not make any appropriations, according to her testimony earlier today, to alleviate the stress and problems of an election. And so if Zuckerman or some other billionaire or whatever gave the donation, say to New York City, for example, those donations were made to the city to do things that the city would ordinarily do, like have more polling places or nonpartisan activities. Is that what we ought to assume?
Ms. Moore, I don't know the history of the specific use of funds.
Okay. Well, thank you. So anyway, I just in closing, I would just ask you to reiterate, there's nothing about this initiative that suggests that there's a lack of transparency with this kind of giving. The Zuckerberg Act, there's no allegation or assertion that somehow the city or county or governmental entities are using it for partisan purposes. Is that?
Ms. Moore, just to reiterate, the legislation prospectively says that if an organization were to provide any funding to a state or local governmental unit for administration of use in administration of elections, then that organization will lose its qualifications as a 501c3 organization. So
and
totally
again,
perspective, it doesn't say
okay,
anything
so
about...
so they would lose their charitable status because they're doing charitable work, even though it's not necessarily partisan. I would yield back. Thank you.
Are there additional technical questions? Seeing none, we will move to strike the last word. Ms. Van Dyne is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim that this bill will suppress the vote and undermine our elections. But that's exactly what we're working to prevent. I mean, allowing politically motivated billionaires to funnel money directly to agencies responsible for conducting our elections, one side of the political aisle or the other, is corrupting and undermining election integrity. But let's be honest, this isn't the only way elections are being undermined. As a member of the Small Business Committee, we recently subpoenaed the Small Business Administration over our attempt to get information at stonewalling regarding an agreement the agency came to with the all-important swing state of Michigan to, quote, promote civic engagement in voter registration, including through allowing state officials to engage in in-person voter registration efforts at SBA's business outreach events. Now, an investigation by the House Small Business Committee found that 22 out of 25 such outreach events have taken place in counties with the highest population of Democratic National Committee target demographics. This is hardly nonpartisan. All of this stems from President Biden's executive order, which mandates that every single federal agency register mobilize voters with the express intent of increasing election participation among targeted groups that tend to vote disproportionately Democrat. Again, this is hardly nonpartisan. This administration couldn't care less about using taxpayer dollars responsibly, what laws they are breaking, or about following the direction of Congress. And once again, we're seeing that this administration cares about one thing. That's holding on to power at any cost. The American people deserve the truth about these nefarious and potentially illegal acts. Unfortunately, we're being stonewalled, one organization and one agency after another. This bill is an important step to protecting our elections. We will continue to pursue our rightful role of oversight as we fight to hold the Biden administration accountable. And with that, I yield.
Mr. Doggett is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, you told us that you thought that this bill was aptly named. I must say that I strongly disagree, and so does the Anti-Defamation League, which said that the whole use of the Zuckerbucks was an anti-Semitic trope, suggesting that rich Jews control levers of power. It reminds me of the claim of another of our Republican colleagues that Jewish space lasers were responsible for California wildfires. I'm sure that's not your intent nor that of the author, but the use of this term is really, I think, pretty outrageous. Let's look at what this nefarious Jewish money did across the country. And first, remember the time that we were in at the time that Mr. Zuckerberg made these charitable contributions. It was a time of incredible mismanagement and misinformation from President Trump that led to thousands of deaths. This is during the time when he was recommending that people inject themselves with disinfectant, so outrageous that Lysol had to issue public warnings against doing it. This was a time when he suggested that horse dewormer was perhaps the proper treatment for COVID, as thousands of people died without adequate preparation and without this misinformation. So how was the money used? Well, I turned to my home county, which is Travis County, Texas, Austin, Texas, and we got $1 million as a result of this funding. And the money was used for safe and efficient election day administration. They were having difficulty getting people to come out to be election judges. It involved poll worker recruitment. It involved training and safety efforts so that people that came to the polls wouldn't be scared away, and it involved encouraging early voting and voting by mail. And that's the same type of thing that happened around the country. In fact, to move out of Texas for a moment to Pennsylvania, a report that all 67 of Pennsylvania's counties were invited to apply for this money. 13 of the counties that former President Trump won in 2020 were among those that received assistance. And to turn to Mr. Kelly's county, Erie County, the employees there, the election administrator there said, we would have had to go to county taxpayers several times without these funds. Of course, when we turn to federal funding for this and the Republicans were in control, we asked for an increase in the election security grants from the current level. Instead of increasing those election security grants, they zeroed them out so that there was no federal assistance at this time for election security. In Texas, which is ground zero for voter suppression, 50th among the states, the worst in the country in terms of voter suppression, there was not support, and the work that Mr. Zuckerberg did through his charitable contribution was not aimed at any particular county. In fact, all of this suggestion that it only goes to counties that President Biden won, the whole Democratic approach is turn out the vote. The whole Republican approach is turn it off. The fewer the voters, the better. And so the suggestion that some of this money went to encourage people to vote in Houston or in Austin or in Dallas or any of the other urban centers of Texas is just a suggestion that if you make it safer, if you made it, for example, in the case of Houston, they used all 24-hour-a-day voting so that people that were night workers could actually turn up at the polls. Republicans have been so encouraged by the increased turnout that they had in Houston that, like this bill, they have denied private groups the ability to contribute in the future, and they have prohibited 24-hour voting. They want to prohibit any drive-by voting where those who could come through and cast their vote easily. That's the kind of thing that turned up the vote, yes, in counties that President Biden won, but not in any improper way, and this money was offered across the country in a nonpartisan way. This isn't about election interference. It's about promoting the myth that President Trump won the last election, and that the only reason that he is not in office is because of these conspiracies that were against them. This promotes the whole notion that led to the mobs attacking this Capitol in the insurrection that Trump inspired on January the 6th. There is just no amount of Republican misinformation that could overcome what Americans have been able to see for themselves concerning that insurrection. The Trump-inspired conspiracy theories like the Zuckerbucks story is just another way to appeal to the far right. To preserve our democracy, we must ensure that truth overcomes these lies. And I yield back.
Mr. Ferguson is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I sit here stunned in disbelief that my colleague from Texas would refer to this as an anti-Semitic bill. That's even a new, that's a
well,
new
the gentleman yielded. It's the Anti-Defamation. I'm just quoting the Anti-Defamation League.
For you to say that on this dais is just absolutely abhorrent, and I'm really, bless your heart.
Take it up with the Anti-Defamation League.
So let me say this. So look, what we should be doing in Congress is following the Constitution, and we should recognize a couple of things. Number one, states should control elections, and most importantly, what we should be doing is making this process completely transparent as it relates to money, whether it's a 50C13, 4, or whether it's small dollar donations. We should know every single dollar that flows into every single election. And I think that's really important. You want to talk about rhetoric? Do you remember when Georgia, my home state of Georgia, and Governor Brian Kemp passed the election integrity bill? I remember the rhetoric from the other side, the disinformation coming from the other side that said that it would suppress votes, that it would hurt minority communities, that it would disenfranchise every single community. Well, you know what? In the state of Georgia, we made it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and guess what happened? We had the highest turnout and highest number of new registrations of every single demographic group because we made it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And I think that is one heck of a record in the state of Georgia. And that effort led by Governor Kemp really has turned out to show that more people are voting right now in every single demographic vote, in every group, and they are going to the polls in record numbers. And it's not because of nonprofits, it's not because of anything else, but because people have confidence in our election system in the great state of Georgia, as they should. So what I think we need to be doing is we really do need to know where the dollars are going and who they are coming from. We need to make sure that there isn't outside money coming in. We need to make sure that through the small dollar donation side that we know where every single dollar is coming from. I would hope that every Republican and Democrat would be open to that. How do you know, if you don't have to report small dollar amounts, how do you know exactly where those dollars are coming from? If you look at the platforms of both Win Red and Act Blue, there's not enough transparency there at the lower levels, at the small dollar donors. It's important that we shine light on that. The dark money that's in a 501c4, again, that is, whether it's a Republican billionaire or whether it's a Democrat billionaire or an independent billionaire, we should know exactly who is given money to go in and play in elections on either side of the aisle. So I'll just say this. I really do think that our goal here should be making sure states are in control of elections, as says in as the Constitution says, to be completely transparent with where the dollars are coming from. And I don't care, I mean, and that is if you are a billionaire or you're giving $5 to a campaign. Americans deserve to know where those dollars, who those dollars are coming from and what they're being used for in our campaigns. Let's be transparent in all of this. And by the way, we have a significant deficit in this country. We are facing real problems in funding our military, making sure that we can be safe here by funding our border. We have so many things that we need to be funding, and I'm not sure that giving billionaires tax breaks to give to nonprofits to play an election is the wisest use of our tax dollars. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I agree with Mr. Doggett that we could have found a better title for the legislation. But I'm disappointed by this bill. The Republican leadership seemed to be vested in the false narrative that the 2020 elections were stolen. And now they're bringing this fiction to the Ways and Means Committee, which I think has another function. Mark Zuckerberg did not undermine the 2020 elections. As has been stated, the funds went to state governments to help them with their elections. And I know there are some who would believe that state governments don't need the help or shouldn't have the help, or there's no purposeful use for the help. But I can assure you that there are many places and many states where the help is greatly needed and useful. Illinois received $5.3 million. Only 12 counties in Illinois voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Only 12 counties, but 58 counties received grants from the Zuckerberg nonprofit. So the vast majority of counties in Illinois that got help went for President Trump. So I'm puzzled at how the Republican leadership can falsely claim that these grants led to fraud when the facts so clearly represent the opposite. In fact, this bill aligns with the GOP effort to eliminate all election security funding, like the House pushed last year. You know, it's kind of unfortunate that we continue to see Republican policymakers erect voting barriers after knowing that the facts do not represent the action. The African Americans and other low-income Americans who have difficulty in some instances just knowing that information is available. And so if we're really interested in increasing opportunity for people to participate, we should facilitate those opportunities in any way that we can and not desecrate, deny, delay, and not let it happen. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Chu is recognized to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word. Elections are enormous logistical undertakings that do not happen automatically. They require two fundamental ingredients: adequate resources and the hard work of public election officials in every city, county, and state across the country. We've already seen the lengths that Republicans will go to in order to disparage and undermine the work of these election officials. We saw it clearly after the 2020 election, and especially on January 6, 2021, when 147 congressional Republicans voted to overturn the results of that Democratic election. Now we're seeing yet another attack on our election system, this time to the resources that this system relies on to facilitate our democracy. Elections are already underfunded by Congress, and this lack of predictable, adequate funding is creating challenges for officials across the country, especially in rural and underserved areas. But instead of addressing this underlying problem, the bill before us today would only exacerbate it by taking aim at a source of supplemental funding that helped our elections take place despite the incredible challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it would do so based on an evidence-free claim that these grants were partisan in nature. This is simply not true. Grants were given to all who applied. The Federal Election Commission even examined these claims in 2022 and rejected them in a bipartisan, unanimous vote. But nevertheless, this bill uses this debunked theory in order to justify proposals that would weaken our election system and make it harder for Americans to participate in our democracy. Democrats, on the other hand, have been working for years to strengthen our democracy. Our For the People Act would reverse the federal disinvestment in election infrastructure that makes nonprofit support necessary in the first place. For instance, it would create new grants for states to replace voting machines and improve system security and make enormous new investments in election infrastructure. And on top of that, it would improve voter access to the ballot, reduce the influence of money in politics, and ensure that public servants work for the public interests. That is what Congress should be working on instead of taking aim at the already inadequate funding for our election system. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this legislation, and I yield back.
Mr. Pascrell.
It's not a good day in the neighborhood today, Mr. Chairman. Not a good day. I didn't expect to speak on this, but I will. So we're really concerned, hopefully, in the integrity of elections. I think most people on both sides of the aisle, that's an objective. Whether we're talking about votes or we're talking about money and where it's coming from. I don't think you'll get much of a pushback from Democrats about knowing who is providing the money, if it goes to an organization, how the organization spends it, and if it does so legally. But now we're really talking about, and the phrase came up, the term came up, election deniers. Now, I know on the vote side, not the money side, but the vote side, over 60 judges made decisions about that, many of them chosen by leadership on the Republican side. Next, we'll hear that they were all Democratic judges. I'm sure we'll slip that in there someplace. And they took their time to examine every one of the complaints that were made, talking about on the voting side. So to the election deniers, I say to you, what are you denying? Many people on the other side of the aisle never even congratulated the president when he was elected. This is America, not Red China. Don't you preach to us about what's right and wrong. If I want to go hear preaching, I'll go Sunday morning to church. Deniers. And the guy that ran for president, and who was president, and ran again, he's the biggest denier. Yeah, what evidence? Shake your head. Shake your head. You've obviously done zero research. Zero. I wouldn't even say 2%. The courts reviewed every complaint. So we want to know where every vote and how the vote was cast, and we want to know where the vote went to. So you're striking out on that side of the ledger in terms of zero. Some of those complaints that were made to the over 60 judges that had to rule had to do with financing. Zero. You scored 0 deniers, and that's what this is all about. Who are you kidding? It's about denying the election of a president of the United States of America. You can smile all you want. This is the truth. It hurts. I know it does. You listen to the baloney. Tell me one judge that ruled in your favor. One on the issue that we're talking about today. It's sad. It's come to this. There are good people on your side. I respect Republicans. I've worked with Republicans. Most of my legislation is bipartisan. But it's difficult to do it nowadays. It's difficult to do it because we're not working on evidence. We're working on hearsay. In the greatest country in the world, we're acting like a banana republic. I yield back.
Additional members wish to strike the last word. Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. This is a very distressing hearing, not just because of the subject matter, subject that's at hand, providing monies in a benevolent way to cities and states so that they could administer elections, but really sort of undermining the whole purpose of the 501c3 status. You know, where does this is a slippery slope, Ms. Tenney. I mean, you know, if some billionaire decides to donate to the Performing Arts Center in my town, where 70% of the African-American population of the entire state lives in Milwaukee, you know, is there going to be some pushback? Or is he going to lose that status because of the type of people who might benefit from those performing arts, or donate to the schools? If you know, if he wants to donate computers to the schools, is that, you know, I'm very disturbed about where this will go ultimately. I will never, ever, ever forget the spring of 2020 when COVID hit, when my first foster youth person that I met here in this body texted me from Frederick Hospital and says, I have COVID, and then at age 26, he died. I'll never forget how 7,000 poll workers couldn't be recruited because of COVID-19, and how 182 polling sites in the city of Milwaukee were reduced to just 5 in that spring election because the pandemic was so horrible and it claimed so many lives. Now think about it. Milwaukee, a population which admittedly has is a third African American, 182 sites reduced to 5. And another community that I'm proud to represent, Whitefish Bay, has a population of 14,000 people, and they had 3 polling sites. Why? For one thing, is that the city was able to maintain and sustain and keep those 3 open for the 14,000 people versus the city of Milwaukee, who couldn't keep the 182 polling sites open. But here's a billionaire, Zuckerberg, who donated money to cities all over and counties all over the country, everywhere, in 2020, didn't support any particular candidate, but provided things like drop boxes. And I'll never forget the year 2020, when both my sons were in the hospital with COVID, where I contracted COVID after having been diagnosed with cancer and had an immune system that was deficient, and I couldn't afford to go out, and I used a drop box. Yes, I used the drop box in 2020. Nobody influenced my vote. Nobody told me who to vote. I've been voting since I was first able and capable of voting. That drop box did not do anything to determine my vote. It just allowed me to vote without dying. And so here we are with this very cynical proposal to strip 501c3s, organizations, of their benevolent organizational efforts in a situation where New York, Milwaukee, lots of cities are struggling to keep fire and police. We just raised taxes so we can have fire and police. You know, and you, gentlelady from New York, you mentioned that Cuomo, that New York, a city which often has problems balancing its budget, couldn't respond in the same way that my community, Whitefish Bay, was able to respond to ensure that its residents were able to vote. I just say shame on this legislation. I'm not going to say shame on you, but this is morally questionable, and I would yield back.
Mr. Feenstra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Congresswoman Bethendine.
I appreciate that very much. I feel the need to respond. I was just called out for shaking my head. I will shake my head. I got sworn in as a Congress member on January 3rd of 2021, and a couple days later had to vote on whether or not to look at each of the states and whether or not they followed their constitutional duty of having the state legislators make decisions on how their elections were conducted. That's our constitutional duty. And I will argue that not all states did that. Because of COVID, used as an excuse, yes, it was a time unprecedented. But a lot of them allowed their courts to usurp the authority that is constitutionally provided to the state legislators. As a brand new member of this body, we had an opportunity to look at this information to decide whether or not this was a rubber stamp, or did Congress actually have a duty to look at what it was doing? The Constitution is a small document. It's not very long. I don't believe that there's rubber stamps that are put in there. But the idea that us taking seriously our oath, our duty, in looking at information, whether or not it's constitutionally protected, is somehow being a, quote, election denier and calling out names as if we should be embarrassed because we looked at the information and we made a decision. It's ridiculous to get that personal about it. We all stand up here and we try to do our best with the information that we have. And we had our speaker at the time, who is a constitutional attorney, defend that decision and talk specifically about why it was so important that we vote that way, to protect the state legislators having the ability to be able to define their election laws. Nobody on the other side of the aisle can say that it was not different things that we did during the 2020 election because of COVID. There were a lot of things that were randomly thrown out that were not proven in court. But you want to talk about election deniers. The more we learn about the 2016 election, the more illegitimate it becomes. America deserves to know whether or not we have a fake president in the Oval Office. Hashtag Russian interference. Was that a Republican that said that? No. That was Hakeem Jeffries that said that. There was absolutely no COVID at that time. What's happened with Russian interference? Oh, that's right, that was debunked. And yet we're still going back to that. I would suggest we've got a lot of policymaking to do. We've got a lot of things going on in the world. To sit here and have these personal attacks on one another, it's not productive. It is not unifying. It's not what the rest of the world needs to see from United States Congress members. I would really hope that we could do better. I'm going to try to do better. And with that, I yield.
Mr. Byer is recognized to strike the last word. Mr. Schneider is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't even know where to begin, but I'm going to try to make 3 points. I do want to reflect on a point my colleague, Mr. Ferguson, brought up earlier about anti-Semitism. And I'll be clear, I don't think anyone on this committee, by intent, by design, in their heart, is anti-Semitic. And I don't think the bill we're talking today and the title used had any intention of anti-Semitism behind it. It doesn't change the fact, and I think this is what my friend from Texas was saying, is that the root of the term and the history of the use of the term has been anti-Semitic, and I think that's what ADL was trying to say, and it's unfortunate title of this bill. But I want to be clear, I don't think anyone is accusing anyone else in this room of anti-Semitism, nor should they. I also want to touch on the conversation around elections. I think we all will agree that it should be easy for every American who wants to cast a vote in any election, every American citizen who wants to cast a vote in any election, to cast their vote. And that every one of them should have certainty that their vote will be counted. And that all of us together should have confidence that the tally of the vote reflects the honest outcome of the election. That's our goal. The challenge is, or the unfortunate reality is this bill doesn't move us towards that. I support transparency. I know that the best way to give confidence in our elections is to inspire people living in our communities to step forward and be election judges. Tasks that are very difficult but should not be vilified, should not be threatened, the people who choose to do it. And we may need to make sure that our local communities have the resources they need to protect the integrity of the elections we cherish and hold dear. We should be working together on this, not screaming at each other, not shaking heads at each other or pointing fingers at each other. That does us no good. What we should be doing is sitting down and figuring out how do we make sure our states, our cities, our counties have the resources they need to give confidence to the American people that our elections are fair and honest, and that our democracy, which I suspect any one of us would be willing to lay our lives on the line to defend, is actually something that can stand tall in the most difficult moments of time. I don't think this bill help moves us forward. I'll be voting against it. I yield back.
Ms. Tinney is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And just for some clarifications on a few of these issues, Mr. Doggett's comments, the false narratives, the partisan rhetoric are beneath the dignity of this venerable committee, and I reject them. But as to the anti-Semitic trope about the name of this bill, this name has been used in numerous states, including Georgia, Florida, and others, to stop this interference in elections. And I just thought I should point out to some of the people who are concerned as we go into what could probably be another very close election year. The 2020 election was decided by approximately 44,000 votes between the state of Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. And if you just look briefly at how the results and how close these results were, Arizona was decided by 10,457 votes. Georgia, 12,670 votes. Michigan, these are states with millions of residents and millions of voters. Michigan, 154,188. Nevada, 33,596. Pennsylvania, 81,680. Wisconsin, 20,682. That is not a lot of votes for a country that has over 350 million people and millions of votes. And a lot of money spent focused on these areas. More money went into the swing states, and 92% of that money went to Democrat-leaning areas, I contend, to prime the pump. And I think my Democratic colleagues would be taking a different position if, for in fact, we allowed a group like, for example, the National Rifle Association to be able to assist in elections. Another not-for-profit group that could actually assist in elections, they would take a different position. I contend that my dear friend at the end of the aisle, Ms. Moore, who I love dearly, she's a wonderful representative, she's smart. If she won the lottery, say she only won 10 million, let's say she didn't win the $1 billion, I guarantee you she would not put her lottery ticket in a drop box. Guaranteed. Because you cannot ensure the integrity of where those votes are going and how they're being counted. It has been proven. And I think I've had a number of Democrats from New York State, particularly New York City, who have said, if I could only join the Election Integrity Caucus, I would, because we need integrity in New York elections, particularly in New York City. And I want to tell you, Republicans almost never win down there. We have a couple of notable examples, my colleague Nicole Maliotakis, but those are primaries, and there have been a lot of irregularities and allegations of fraud between Democrats and primaries in New York City. So we're trying to have integrity in our elections to ensure that the sacred right to vote is secured, that these are things that are not partisan, they are just facts. And we want to make sure that we are not going to have partisans on either side of the aisle interfere in our elections when these are the obligations of government, and particularly our local governments, not the federal government interfering and taking away the states' rights under the 10th Amendment. That's why I put this bill forward. That's why it is a federal, just dealing with the IRS protections. It is not a federal law in terms of that. It's just dealing with the ability of actors who we may or may not like. You may not like some of the Republican large donors that could be involved in doing this. And so that's why this bill is necessary, to make sure that we keep these partisans out of our elections, stop them from doing an end run around our IRS laws, and to be able to use elections to manipulate, to prime the pump, whatever, on either side of the aisle. That's why this bill is necessary, and it has been proven successful. Similar types of legislation in Georgia and Florida and other states where they've been passed, and we've seen huge outcomes because more people are voting and people are making voting great again in these states, and we've seen an increase in election integrity and less irregularities. That's the mission of this bill. It has nothing to do with some of the tropes being sent around, and that's why I support it, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And I know some of my Democratic colleagues are going to wish this were in place if the outcome looks a lot different on November and President Trump wins this election this time around. So with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Neal.
Thank you. So I think the angst on our side over these proposals largely comes from the following fact. Aaron Burr and John Adams accepted the result of an election. Samuel Tilden accepted the result of an election. Richard Nixon accepted the result of an election. Al Gore, in a moment that avoided tearing this country apart, accepted the result of an election. Hillary Clinton in 2016 conceded. We're waiting for the concession speech, as America is. We don't question the sincerity of the gentlelady from New York. We question the idea that there's this promotion across the country that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, did not win the election. That's the underlying tone of the debate today, and it should be recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional members wish to strike the last word. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to my friend, Ms. Moore.
I just want to acknowledge that I have a very friendly relationship with Representative Tenney, so I do want her to know that I appreciate any efforts that she might advance to make sure that everybody could vote. And in fact, if the NRA wanted to fund drop boxes in Wisconsin, I would be happy to see them. You know, I just wanted to go on, just so you all will know, one of the conversations that I had with Marjorie Taylor Greene when I sat with her during the State of the Union was about election integrity. Because I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of the states, as you've noted, where the election was close in 2020. In 2020, and part of that money was used for election drop boxes. And again, I used it because I not only had a serious illness that put me at risk, I had, stayed sequestered in my home for all other purposes. And yes, if I had had that lottery, my vote is just as sacred as a lottery ticket would have been. And I very often don't vote absentee, but I put my sacred vote in that lockbox and trusted it. I just want to point out that that Wisconsin was the epicenter of the fake elector scheme. It was designed and put together in Wisconsin. And so just to put a face on the type of person that there was an attempt to disenfranchise, as I pointed out to Marjorie Taylor Greene, I was the face of that. I was not some person that Mark Zuckerberg tried to influence me to vote one way. I voted the way I wanted to vote, and I was very happy to have had this assistance. As I pointed out, our city is very poor. We have a very low tax base. We have some of the poorest children in the country that live in Milwaukee. And wealthy people have an opportunity to vote. They don't move as often. One of the things that we learned from data and statistics in that primary in Wisconsin, that suburbanites had a 50% turnout, which is not super, but it certainly was better than the 27% turnout that we had in Milwaukee because of COVID. And because we had 182 polling sites that were closed, all except for 5 in the city of Milwaukee for the lack of money. And so, to say that this bill is before us for election integrity, I would say it's before us for election suppression, to make sure that the 20,000 votes that came out of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada, that you can squeeze those votes out by efforts, people's poverty and the dearth of money can really create an outcome that is more favorable to wealthy people. I just want to point out that wealthy people have lots of opportunities to influence the election. We have what is truly called dark money. As I pointed out in my inquiry with Mr. Bartow, we knew who Mark Zuckerberg was. This was not foreign money. This was transparent money given to municipalities to do things like drop boxes, and things that had absolutely no partisan edge to them at all. To the extent that African Americans Poor people often live in cities, might be a reason that the funds were appropriated to those areas. But they were appropriated all over the country, including some red areas in my state. And I would thank Mr. Kildee for the time, and I would yield back to him.
Thank you. Are there additional members that wish to strike the last word? Ms. Sewell.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to again reiterate that the problem with election integrity, or the source, the foundation of which, is inadequate funding. We, this body, in 2000, through the Help Americans Vote Act, established the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. We have, since 2000, not adequately funded elections. And that is the problem. So I look forward to working with Ms. Tenney so that we can adequately offer public funding of election administration. The reality is, without it, having opportunities from 501c3 private funding in a nonpartisan way to give folks, these cities, these towns, the resources they need to administer elections, by stopping that, especially when there's no proof that there was any partisan implications or results from the use of those grants. Unfortunately, that's the only way many of these cities and towns can actually get money to administer elections. Now, if we're really going to be serious about trying to make sure that we can ensure the administration of elections, especially federal elections, then we must use a vehicle by which we have established, which is the United States Election Assistance Commission. So instead of zeroing out their budget, let's fully fund the United States Election Assistance Commission and provide adequate public funding for the administration of elections. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Further members wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, we'll move to amendments. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ms. Sewell.
I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
A point of order has been made. Would the gentleman suspend while the amendment is distributed? Proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I put forth this amendment with the hope that the members of this committee will, at a minimum, recognize and allow for what should be a simple and uncontroversial act, that of distribution of water to any individual waiting in line to vote. I myself have stood in line to vote on 90-degree days in the state of Alabama. Many of my constituents, ranging in age and status of health, cherish their ability to take part in the democratic process and vote in person at their local polling stations, many of whom have waited hours to vote, especially since without the Voting Rights Act of 1965's full protections, one can actually change a polling station in states like Alabama without providing notice. So long lines. And what we saw during the 2022 election was we saw states like Georgia implement statutes that refuse to give bottles of water to people standing in line. So this simple amendment would attach the requirement or the ability for the distribution of water to be allowed to prevent health emergencies that happen in heat and dehydration. And I'm just trying to point out the hypocrisy of the fact that we, and this is germane because it's all about integrity of elections, we don't want people falling and fainting out while they're waiting in these long lines in order to go and vote. So the simple distribution of water should be allowed, and that should be allowed federally across all 50 states, not giving a state like Georgia the ability to stop someone from being able to receive a bottle of water. I ask my colleagues to support this very simple It should be uncontroversial amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Discussion on the amendment, Ms. Tinney.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word on. I greatly appreciate my colleague introducing an amendment, but this bill actually has nothing to do with the specifics of what can be done at an election site. It merely says there will not be there will not be private funding of elections in a general way. That would be something up to the states. So I think that in that case, it seems to be not really relevant to this bill, maybe not germane in the legal sense of it, because this bill would attach to something on a state level bill, and not as something that deals with IRS and federal funding, which is why the main bill in chief is specifically not about interfering with the state's rights to control and to deal with elections. So I appreciate what she's trying to do, but I think this is more appropriate on the state level bill as opposed to this bill, which is much more general and just deals strictly with funding, not the
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes, sure.
So I think what I really want is for you and I and others who really are trying to get at the heart of election integrity to work to try to fully fund public funding. And I think the only way that we can get there, and perhaps this amendment doesn't purport to do that, it doesn't actually get us where we want, which is more money and more resources for the administration of elections everywhere, not unevenly distributed, but distributed. And so I just want to say, I am willing to work with you, with the gentlelady from New York, so that we can really address the underlying issue, which is inadequate funding for administrations of federal elections. Thank you, and I yield back to you.
Thank you. No, and I appreciate that. And I do agree with you that often these elections are underfunded, specifically the 2020 election. And I point to New York as a great example, with 100 bill changes made by then Governor Cuomo, with no additional ability of the people in those states to actually, the local boards of elections were overstressed. They overstressed the system. They made it impossible for them to carry out their job. And a lot of very good, committed people work in these organizations trying to make sure we have election integrity. So that is an important issue. I just think on the federal side, I worry about federal funding and interference with states' rights and the constitutional standards, which require that elections be administered by the states and not from the federal side. But in terms of expanding and working on funding through the government and not private entities, which is exactly what this bill is trying to prevent, I think that would be very helpful. There are a lot of great things we can do to ensure election integrity that I think would guarantee that we have one citizen, one vote. All that can be done, and we could do it in a way to verify that using modern technology. I've been to many exhibitions and ways that we can do it using much more efficient methods other than signature requirements and some of those things that are very cumbersome and sort of older and hard to verify. But the whole issue is verification and making sure that we have one citizen, one vote, and we don't undermine anyone's right to vote. And I do think, I appreciate the amendment and I appreciate your willingness to work, but I think we can do this. We need to do it on the state level, and we need to work with state resources and enhance the ability of each of our states to provide for election integrity and to provide and protect our citizens' rights to vote. Because a lot of citizens feel that they don't feel like our elections are safe, they don't agree that they're fair, and they don't often think their vote is counted. But I understand that impact probably as much as anyone, as maybe my other colleague, Representative Marionette Miller Meeks. I won my election in 2020 after being up 28,422 votes on Election Day. I spent 100 days in court. I was the last person sworn in on February 11th, 2021, and I ended up winning by 109 votes. Marionette Miller Meeks won by 6. These are proof that every vote does count, and we need to make sure that we preserve that for every citizen and that they have that preservation. And I appreciate the amendment, but honestly, I would rather see this on the state level and work on getting the funding and the resources we need there, including modernization. But thank you so much. I appreciate it, Representative Sewell.
Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to my dear friend from Alabama, who we have many wonderful conversations and share a lot of the same desires for our fellow citizens in rural areas. I completely agree with the gentlelady from New York. This is a state issue. We don't need to be fooling with this at the federal level, so I'm opposed at it. But since it is a state issue, I'd like to point out that in the great state of Georgia, where we made it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and we had a higher turnout than we've ever had with every single demographic group, we did not have a single person fall out in line because they didn't have water. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and would urge a no vote on this amendment.
Further discussion. Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Ms. Sewell.
Thank you so much for yielding. To the gentleman from Georgia, a dear friend of mine, the reality is that your state did impose a limitation on providing bottled water because perhaps the people who were handing the water were, were part of some sort of different organization, oftentimes a 501c3, sometimes a Christian organization. And the reality is that if we allowed for water to be distributed in long lines and irrespective of, of where it came from, that we would have a better, more hydrated, more healthier electorate trying to vote. Look, the reality is that states sometimes impose ridiculous requirements, and I'm sorry, preventing the administration of bottled water was lunacy, in my opinion.
Will the gentle lady
I
yield?
surely will yield.
Thank you. Keep in mind, you could give any organization could get all the water that they wanted, just not within a certain distance of the polls. While we think that the voters' health is very important, we sure weren't going to allow electioneering that close to the polls. Something that has happened.
How is providing bottles of water electioneering? I guess I'm really baffled by it. I don't know if you and I will actually agree. I'm going to reclaim my time. We'll actually agree on this, but I hear what you're saying, that you feel as if these particulars, as does Representative Tenney, that these particular are left to the states. And I just want to remind the gentleman and the gentlelady that if we left everything to the states, I wouldn't be a member of Congress, let alone have the right to vote. And so what I'm saying is the federal government should step in when states are suppressing people's right to vote. I think that the fact that Georgia has such a law is ridiculous, and that's why I want it on a federal level to at least be able to administer water while people are in line. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Doggett.
Well, thank you. I think the opposition to this amendment shows how extreme the original bill is. It's a very reasonable amendment, but I want to take this opportunity, given some of the comments that have been made by Republican colleagues since my earlier remarks, to ask unanimous consent to place in the record the Times of Israel Zuckerbucks Republican nickname for Facebook CEO riles anti-Semitism watchdog, and I offer that for the record.
Without objection.
And let me just point out that while I certainly made clear in my remarks that I was sure this wasn't the intent, that this does perpetuate using this title. This is a technical amendment to federal law. It didn't need to use the term Zuckerbucks, but I'm sure my colleagues will remember that they called Jonathan Greenblatt here to testify only recently about events on campus. And here's what Mr. Greenblatt had to say about the title of this bill. In recent years, we've seen anti-Semites alleging that Mark Zuckerberg is proof of this stereotype. Those who use the term Zuckerbucks, particularly members of Congress, are dangerously enabling this anti-Semitic trope, and we urge these policymakers to stop using this term immediately. There's more about this in the article that's part of the record if my colleagues want to read it. This bill did not have to have this title. The bill is misguided. The opposition to the amendment is even more misguided, but this name should not be associated with the legislation. I yield back.
Further discussion. Seeing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Sewell. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan?
No.
Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska, no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, no. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, no. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, no. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, no. Mrs. Miller. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, no. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, no. Ms. Tinney. Ms. Tinney, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, no. Mrs. Steele. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, no. Mr. Feenstra. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, no. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, no. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez.
Yeah, you're still, no, yeah, it's your turn, Ms. Sanchez.
Ms. Sanchez, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, no.
How is Mr. Arrington recorded?
Mr. Arrington is not recorded. Mr. Arrington, no. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, no. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, no. Mr. Evans? Chairman Smith?
No.
Chairman Smith, no.
Clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 17, the noes are 24.
There being 17 ayes and 24 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 8291 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 8291 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan?
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington? Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller? Dr. Murphy? Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff? Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe, yes. Ms. Tinney? Ms. Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fischbach? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele? Ms. Van Dyne? Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra? Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis? Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Peskrell? Mr. Peskrell, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Evans? Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider, no. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta, no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez, no.
How is Ms. Steele recorded?
Mrs. Steele is not recorded. Mrs. Steele, yes. Mrs. Miller? Mrs. Fischbach? Mr. Evans? Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 23, the noes are 17.
There being 23 ayes and 17 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 8291 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 8291 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 8293, the American Donor Privacy and Foreign Funding Transparency Act, introduced by Representative Schweikert. This bill protects the privacy of American donors by prohibiting federal agencies like the IRS from inventing and demanding a level of disclosure on American citizens not required under the law. It would also bring some much-needed transparency to how foreign entities like the Chinese Communist Party are using tax-exempt organizations to fund and influence our political and policy debates right here in the United States. I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to fellow members, let's be honest, this is a baby step. And part of my goal here is I actually think something we need to work on, and we have to do it in a bipartisan fashion, is we do need to modernize the 990 forms. So we understand 17% of the economy now is in the tax-exempt status world. Okay, move forward, understand what's happening there. I have a personal fixation that we live in the age of bad actors around the world sort of flood our society with things to put us at each other's throat. How do we know how that money is coming to us? If we all think about this, if you're going to be a lobbyist for a foreign entity, you got to register it. If you're if you're a foreigner and you want to make a contribution to one of us, you cannot do it. We've already sort of tried to lock it out. So what happens when malevolent actors start to actually now use parts of our nonprofit sector to potentially manipulate our society? All we're doing here is saying, if it's over a certain threshold, tell us not necessarily even who they are, but that it exists. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. While today's markup is apparently about promoting the American people's faith in our electoral system, this bill under consideration shows just how empty the majority's commitment is to that ideal. This bill would further shield tax-exempt organizations from disclosing their wealthy and well-connected donors beyond current law. This ought to be something we can all get together on. It will also allow those to concentrate their ability to quietly influence elections without scrutiny. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
Mr. Chair, it's true that powerful donors use tax-exempt organizations to influence our political system. And this is not primarily an issue of foreign donors. There are plenty of extremely wealthy Americans who make enormous dark money donations to tax-exempt organizations specifically for political purposes, all while evading the accountability and transparency requirements that would apply to donations made to traditional 527 political organizations. But instead of addressing the enormous increase in dark money political spending in recent election cycles, this bill would move in the opposite direction by ensuring that these dark money donors enjoy even more anonymity and even less accountability than under current law. That is because it would completely prohibit any entity of the federal government, including the IRS, from collecting information on donors, even if that information will not be disclosed to the public. We should instead be considering legislation to tighten up our tax code and reduce the influence of money in our politics. In fact, our committee has even heard testimony at recent hearings, including from Professor Philip Hackney in December, about the ways that the tax code incentivizes dark money donations. For example, a loophole allows taxpayers who donate appreciated property like stock in a company to completely avoid capital gains taxes when making the donation to a tax-exempt nonprofit instead of a traditional organization, effectively providing a taxpayer subsidy for political spending. That's exactly why I introduced H.R. 7244, the End Tax Breaks for Dark Money Act, along with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Our bill would close this loophole by ensuring that donations of appreciated property are subject to capital gains taxes when donated to nonprofit organizations that engage in political activity, like 501c4s. In doing so, it would simply treat these donations the same way that they are treated when made to political organizations like PACs. The bill before us not only fails to address loopholes like this one, but actually makes it easier for wealthy individuals to continue to put their thumbs on the scale of our democracy in ways that are so clearly inconsistent with the intent of the law. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 8293, the American Donor Privacy and Foreign Funding Transparency Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, the committee members have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 18 and JCX 23, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The legislation before you makes amendments to the Internal Revenue Code and has non-code provisions. The non-code provisions generally prevent any entity of the federal government from collecting or disclosing information about donors to tax-exempt organizations. The code provisions relate to filings that exempt organizations make with Form 990. On Schedule B, generally, an exempt organization shows contributions of $5,000 or more that have been made to the organization. Schedule B itself is not made public except in the case of private foundations and 527 organizations. The legislation before you requires that the organization, if it is required to file Form 990, that it report on that return with respect to any contribution from a foreign national, whether it received any such contribution, the aggregate amount, the country or principal place of business of the donor, and the aggregate amount of contributions grouped by source country. The underlying legislation was amended to provide an exception for smaller exempt organizations. Those organizations deemed smaller are those with gross receipts of less than $200,000 annually and assets of less than $500,000. The legislation, as amended, also replaces the notion of foreign source with foreign national as defined by reference to the Federal Election Campaign Act. And lastly, the amendment clarifies that in terms of foreign country, in the case of an individual donor, it is the country of citizenship of that individual. For donors other than individuals, such as business entities or nonprofit groups, it is the country in which the organization is organized or created. This legislation would be effective for Form 990 disclosure returns filed in tax years beginning after the date of enactment with respect to the code provisions. The non-tax provision, the prohibition on federal government collection of information is effective on the date of enactment. The Joint Committee staff has estimated that this would have a negligible revenue effect over the fiscal 2024 through 2034 budget period, and the Congressional Budget Office informs us that there would be no significant effect on federal outlays during that same budget period. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Neal.
I have a technical question for Mr. Barthold. It might only be tangentially related to this bill, but is it true that today marks your 15th anniversary as the Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation?
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Neal.
That is a substantive achievement, and we're grateful for your good work. Thanks, Tom.
And very technical in nature. Thank you. That's right.
We didn't give us an economist answer either. It was good.
Are there others? Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And he said yes, Yeah, you're right, it wasn't an
Right.
economic, so should we ask him to calculate his economic loss of his value, spending this much time with us?
Yeah, would the gentleman yield? I think the gentleman is up to that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bartol, I want to make something very clear because one of our friends on the other side was saying some things that I want to clear up. There's nothing in this bill that changes current law on current disclosures for U.S. citizens who are contributing to these types of organizations.
Yeah, Mr. Schweikert, you're starting from, as I noted, that exempt organizations that are required to file Form 990 presently on Schedule B show contributions of $5,000 or more to that organization. There's no change to that. So to the extent that there are received contributions to that organization from an American citizen, greater than $5,000, that would be noted on Schedule B.
Mr. Chairman,
and that would not change under this
Mr. Chairman,
legislation.
Mr. Bartol, and that's current law.
That's current law.
Okay, and that's sort of the point. I want to make sure there's not a conflation in people's minds of someone's aspirational of what it should look like. The fact of the matter is we're not changing as it is today. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Others wishing to ask questions, technical questions? Seeing none, does anyone wish to strike the last word? Seeing none. Thank you. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Kelly for the purpose of offering a motion. Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 8293 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 8293 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Yes.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Dr. Ferguson. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Hearn. Mrs. Miller. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Miss Tinney. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Yes. Mrs. Steele, yes. Ms. Van Dyne. Ms. Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Ms. Maliotakis. Ms. Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Evans. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez, no. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mr. Stubbe. Ms. Tinney? Ms. Tinney, yes. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Evans? Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 23, the noes are 16.
There being 23 ayes and 16 noes, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 8293 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 8293 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 8314, the No Foreign Election Interference Act, introduced by Representative Maliotakis. Foreign nationals are prohibited from donating directly to U.S. elections. But under current law, foreign donations can still influence those elections when the money is funneled through U.S. tax-exempt organizations that then send money to political groups like super PACs. Under this bill, any tax-exempt organization that takes foreign donations and then contributes to a political committee will suffer severe penalties up to and including the loss of their generous tax benefit. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including my bill, the No Foreign Election Interference Act, in this markup. Mr. Chairman, I think it's safe to say that none of us want foreign involvement in our elections, and it is of paramount importance that the United States maintains the legitimacy of its elections and protects them from not only illegal voting, but from interference and influence of foreign threats. And under current law, foreign nationals are prohibited from donating to political committees, but there are no restrictions on foreign nationals flowing money through tax-exempt organizations that then move money into super PACs that get involved in American elections. This is a tremendous loophole. Public reporting suggests that foreign nationals are taking advantage of a loophole in the tax code which allows tax-exempt entities that receive contributions from foreign nationals and then turn around and donate large sums to political committees. For example, a foreign national has reportedly donated money from his U.S.-based tax-exempt organizations to other organizations that then sent tens of millions of dollars to super PACs. As just one example, according to the New York Times, between 2016 and 2020, this individual donated significant sums of money to the 1630 Fund, which subsequently sent over $20 million to super PACs that supported Democrats. Additionally, Black Lives Matter, the organization behind the anti-police riots that crippled Manhattan, New York City, that I represent, caused destruction to businesses, has a global foundation that receives foreign money and then has a PAC that is investing in political campaigns. This bill would prohibit any tax-exempt organization that receives foreign national contributions, which is why the bill we just did was very important, so we have that transparency. We know who's going to be funding these advocacy groups that promote CCP propaganda and fueling anti-Semitic protests and other things. Now, my bill would complement it by subsequently making contributions to these political committees, such as super PACs, for 8 years. Failure to comply would result in significant fines and eventually revocation of tax-exempt status. I want to thank you again for bringing my legislation to markup today, and I look forward to it being reported at a committee. We need to hold these organizations accountable. We need to make sure that this foreign money is no longer influences our elections, and I yield back.
I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. The American people deserve a free and fair election system that protects our democracy and our right to self-governance. With foreign nationals already prohibited from donating to political candidates, Republicans are now using this legislation to target persons who do not share their political views. That is not how to legislate. We should not target anyone based on their viewpoints. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 8314, the No Foreign Election Interference Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Neal, the members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 19 and JCX 24, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation imposes a penalty on disqualified political committee contributions, and that's generally a contribution by an exempt organization to a political committee as described under the Federal Election Campaign Act. The penalty would be equal to twice the amount of the contribution made. The chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute narrows the legislation to provide an exception for smaller organizations, and a smaller organization is defined as an organization with gross receipts of less than $200,000 per year and assets of less than $500,000. In addition to the penalty, the legislation provides that if a penalty is imposed a third time, then tax-exempt status of the organization would be revoked, and the receipt of a contribution from a foreign national is measured by reference to any contribution made to the organization during the preceding 8-year period prior to which the campaign contribution was made. This legislation would be effective for contributions after 2024 by organizations that are exempt under 501c3. The Joint Committee staff has estimated that it would have a modest effect of increasing federal receipts by less than $500,000 over the budget period 2024 through 2034. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, we'll move to strike the last word. Mr. Pascrell is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. It's been over 13 years since the Supreme Court unleashed a tidal wave of toxic dark money into our politics. Since then, political 501c4s organizations have flooded over $1 billion into federal American elections. Every dollar without any requirement to disclose their source. Since that time, so it's over a decade ago, the other side hailed the decision to let billionaires dominate our elections. And just today, they advanced the bill doubling down on billionaire donor society, secrecy. So let's be clear what today is about. We're targeting tax-exempt organizations that do not align with far-right extreme politics. We have not come a long way in 10 years. In the aftermath of Citizens United, I introduced legislation to ban corporations controlled by foreign actors from making any United States election contributions, period. We had a few Republicans support it. Eventually, it was killed by a Republican filibuster. See, put things in context. Go to the history. We're good at it when it is to our advantage. I know that. But let's go to the context. Let's go to the video. When the IRS tried to crack down on dark money, Republicans created a massive fake scandal lying about conservative groups being targeted. To this day, this committee has not apologized to Lois Lerner, who headed up IRS at the time. And then besides that, to top it all, the icing on the cake, they took double-digit amount of organizations that they say connected directly to the far left, whoever the heck that is. Far right, far left are probably meaningless terms nowadays. They said, we're going to make public your names during that investigation. Nothing came up, nothing concluded from that examination. Not one person was charged, but all their names were revealed. This committee has not apologized to that group. They're not chattel. They're human beings who are in these organizations. So what did we really accomplish? We protected a few donors who could care less about the American dream, but want to donate to the scheme. Despite a comprehensive, if you remember this, Mr. Brotall, the TIGTA, a report in 2017, notice the year, finding no unfair targeting had happened. A Republican appropriations writer blocked the IRS from issuing any regulations. It's a fact. Checked it. If I'm wrong, tell me. That's what happened. Political spending. No regulations. Political spending on 501c4s, organizations. Lawful groups on the left. I want you to remember that. Who are they? So their names were mentioned in private. When that happened in the investigation of the President of the United States, all hell broke out. There are two sets of laws, regardless of whether it sounds prophetic or what. That's what happened. There's a law for somebody, and there's a law for the rest of us. Our colleagues have poured sugar in the gas tank of American democracy and are now demanding to know who crashed our elections. Give me a break. There is clear common ground on tax-exempt oversight. Instead of working together, our colleagues have put forth misleading partisan bills. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Estes is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. This is an election year, and while both sides claim to support election integrity, we must take action to actually make a difference. The bill before us today is a critical step in ensuring our elections remain safe and free from undue foreign influence. By now, it's become clear that the Chinese Communist Party is the chief agitator working to influence our elections and our American way of life. We've passed bipartisan legislation twice to decouple TikTok from the Chinese Communist Party. We've held hearings in this committee and in others looking at our country's competition with China. And we've documented evidence of the CCP and other bad actors supporting U.S.-based nonprofit organizations to prop themselves up and to tear our country down. Unfortunately, there's some of these 501c3s right here in the United States that are run by bad actors who aren't seeking to help our society, but tear at its very fabric. To give just one example, there's a U.S. foundation established by an openly Marxist businessman residing in China who brags of his close ties to the CCP that exists for the sole purpose of funding organizations to the tune of tens of millions of dollars per year with pro-CCP sentiments. This businessman's wife also co-founded a 501c3 that supports numerous activists and openly condemns telling the truth about the CCP, including their internment and maltreatment of the Uyghur people. The dangers of these CCP-funded and fueled nonprofits are numerous, but their impacts on public policy and our elections could be catastrophic for years to come. The best way to rid ourselves of these ill-intended groups that operate under the guise of 501c3s is to support transparency. The No Foreign Election Interference Act does precisely that, and that's why I'm fully supporting it. Instead of allowing foreign nationals to skirt our campaign contribution laws by founding and funding these tax-exempt organizations, we should ensure that no foreign national or country can attempt to buy our elections through propaganda and deceit. I realize this might be too much to ask in today's polarized political climate, but I hope my friends on the left will join me in supporting this common sense legislation. Not doing so would appear to be siding with the CCP and remaining complicit in allowing foreign bad actors to circumvent existing laws for the sake of accepting foreign cash. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Are there additional members that wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, we'll move to amendments. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 8314 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 8314 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Hearn. Mrs. Miller. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Miss Tinney. Miss Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Yes. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Miss Van Dyne. Miss Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Miss Maliotakis. Miss Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Miss Sanchez. Miss Sanchez, yes. Miss Sewell. Miss Sewell, yes. Miss Del Bene. Miss Del Bene, yes. Miss Chu. Miss Chu, yes. Miss Moore. Miss Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Yes. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Evans. Chairman Smith.
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 39, the noes are 1.
There being 39 ayes and 1 no, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 8314 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 8314 and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. Our last order of business is H.R. 8292, the Taxpayer Data Protection Act. Americans file their tax returns every year with the expectation that their data and personal tax information are protected and secure from unlawful disclosure. Unfortunately, the recent criminal actions of an IRS leaker make clear that Congress must act to ensure these crimes are fully prosecuted and that would-be bad actors are deterred in the future. Between 2017 and 2021, Charles Littlejohn worked as a contractor for the IRS through the firm of Booz Allen. Half of Mr. Littlejohn's taxpayer-funded career was spent stealing taxpayer information. In particular, information belonging to President Trump, as well as that of other political targets. Mr. Littlejohn then leaked the confidential tax return information to the New York Times and ProPublica so that they could publish articles about President Trump and notable figures such as Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett, along with many others. Mr. Littlejohn took active steps to avoid detection by the IRS, including uploading the information to a private website and storing the information on multiple personal storage devices. Once he became the subject of an investigation into the leaks, he deleted and destroyed evidence linking him to these crimes. Once caught, Mr. Littlejohn admitted that he was, quote, aware of the potential consequences. And in fact, he made his decision, quote, with full knowledge that he would end up in a courtroom. The current law failed to protect taxpayers because it failed to deter Mr. Littlejohn. In September of last year, the Department of Justice made the bizarre decision to charge Mr. Littlejohn with just a single count of unauthorized disclosure of private tax information. He stole the tax return information of thousands of individuals. Some say over 70,000 taxpayer information was released by this individual. He submitted the information to 2 separate news organizations, and he obstructed the DOJ's investigation. After Republicans on this committee sent a letter to the judge overseeing this case about the DOJ's lackluster charge and urged her to give him the maximum sentence available, Mr. Littlejohn did, in fact, receive the maximum under the circumstances, 5 years. 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. During the sentencing, the judge called his crimes, quote, an attack on our constitutional democracy. The bill before us today, sponsored by every Republican member on this committee, helps ensure bad actors are prevented from stealing and disclosing taxpayer information. The Taxpayer Data Protection Act increases the maximum penalty for the unauthorized disclosure of returns and return information to include a fine of up to $250,000 or imprisonment of 10 years or both. It also ensures that each taxpayer impacted by a disclosure will count as a separate and distinct violation of the law. It is up to us as members of the Chief Tax Writing Committee in Congress to protect the public trust and to secure private taxpayer information. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation and send a clear message that Congress will not tolerate criminal leaks of taxpayer information. I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. Let me yield my time, Mr. Chairman, to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell.
Anyone compromising the privacy of Americans must face the full consequences of the law, period. It's been nearly 3 years since the reporting by ProPublica and others revealed how the ultra-wealthy and the powerful hide their assets to avoid paying their fair share. 3 years. Right after these shocking reports were exposed, I was chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee at that time. I called the IRS to immediately investigate the leaked information, and they did. As we know, the responsible IRS contractor, it was a contractor, not an employee of the IRS, has received the maximum statutory sentence of 5 years, which you just heard described a few moments ago. Last Congress, our Oversight Subcommittee convened a hearing on the need to crack down on domestic tax havens to stop rampant billionaire tax cheats. Republicans not only ignored the revelations, they doubled down on schemes to aid and abet rich tax cheats by trying to gut the IRS enforcement wing. The majority has shown over and over that they have zero interest in tax fairness or transparency. We have not held a single hearing on wealthy tax evasion this entire Congress. Not one. And the other side fought tooth and nail to prevent the committee from legally getting Donald Trump's tax records under Section 6103. When I brought it up in 2017, they looked at each other, what's 6103? I'm open to stricter penalties, Mr. Chairman, for unlawfully releasing taxpayer information. I also believe we can do better. This bill would treat each individual disclosure of taxpayer data as a separate crime. This would have meant a maximum sentence of 82,000 years for the recently convicted contractor I just referred to, and you referred to. We can and should talk in a constructive bipartisan way about proper penalties for unlawful disclosure. But let's not get distracted. This is a distraction, that's what it is, from the true issue. We have a two-tier tax system screwing over working people. Mr. Chairman, that's where we are today. And you are the chairman of the Tax Writing Committee, and I look to you for leadership to deal with that problem of the two-tier system. Everybody counts. Everybody should be treated the same, period. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 8292, the Taxpayer Data Protection Act. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of the amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartle, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Chairman Smith, the members of the committee have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 17 and JCX 22, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation modifies the penalties for unlawful disclosure of taxpayer returns and taxpayer return information. Specifically, it would increase the maximum possible fine from present law $5,000 to $250,000. It would increase the present law maximum imprisonment time from 5 years to 10 years. The chairman's amendment, in the nature of a substitute, clarifies that for each taxpayer whose information is disclosed, a separate violation will have occurred. Thus, for example, if an individual makes unlawful disclosures of 7 taxpayers' returns, then 7 violations have occurred. This legislation would be effective upon the date of enactment, and the Joint Committee staff has estimated that this would have a negligible effect on federal budgetary receipts over the fiscal period 2024 through 2034. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Are there any technical questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ms. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly look forward to voting on this bill. I do think that the violations of 6103 are serious, and that we ought to weigh in on that. The question that I have for you, Mr. Barkhold, is the penalties, the increase in penalties from $5,000 per count to $250,000 per count, and from 5 years to 10 years. How does this align with other things in our criminal tax code? Was there any was there any guidance that we received from the Sentencing Commission or something to make sure that this was the appropriate sentencing guidelines?
Ms. Moore, 18 U.S. Code in Section 3571 provides fine structures for individuals. It presently has a maximum fine structure of $250,000. So the increase proposed in the legislation before you today is consistent with 18 U.S.C. 3571 B2, and that's fines for individuals.
Well, I just was wondering, because Mr. Pasquarello, if his analysis is correct, says that this man, Mr. Littlejohn, would have been sentenced to 82,000 years in prison, and I'm just wondering how that compares with the murderers and rapists and drug dealers, and because if we're going to impose sentences, we want to be serious about it. We don't want to appear to be doing it just for revenge. You know, our beloved former president, we're mad because his tax returns were released, and so therefore we're going to propose a ridiculous sentence like 82,000 years. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Further technical questions? Seeing none, we'll move to strike the last word. Would any member wish to strike the last word? Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Neal, I move to strike the last word. All of us believe that the federal government has a duty to safeguard and secure their taxpayer data that they give over to the federal government. As we know well on this committee, tax returns contain very sensitive and very private information about Americans, both financial and personal, that unfortunately can be used to steal money and steal identities. That's foundational as to why the unauthorized release of that data is a serious crime and why people who do it should pay a serious penalty. When Charles Littlejohn, as we've heard in this hearing, leaked information from thousands of taxpayers, including the President of the United States, to ProPublica, that had a number of consequences, not just for the victims, but for the public's trust in our institutions, especially at a time when trust in our institutions is historically low. Now, under Internal Revenue Code Section 7213, the penalty for such an unauthorized release of information is a felony. But the most that one can get is 5 years in jail or pay a fine of just up to $5,000, no matter how many victims, no matter how much information is released. Now, as a former prosecutor, I believe that that type of punishment just doesn't meet the severity, it doesn't meet the gravity of that type of crime. That is why I support this legislation that would increase the total fine to $250,000, the penalty by an additional 5 years, and it would allow a judge to penalize each crime, each victim, and each disclosure consecutively. I believe that that is an appropriate penalty for those who commit this crime, to deter this crime, and to protect taxpayers. But also, this legislation is a way to restore, reinvigorate, and reinforce people's faith in our federal government. As a result, I support this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. Byer.
Move to strike the last word, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a clarified point that Mr. Pascal had made already. Our chairman said that, quoted, our IRS leaker. I just want to make sure that we realize that Mr. Littlejohn was an IRS contractor. He was not an IRS employee. He was not one of our terrific civil service workers, and I hope we don't look askance at our wonderful IRS employees because of the faults of a contractor. With that, I yield back.
Further members wish to strike the last word? Seeing none, we'll move to amendments. Does any member have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Kelly for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 8292 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 8292 as amended to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska, yes. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, yes. Mr. Schweikert. Yes. Mr. Schweikert, yes. Mr. LaHood. Yes. Mr. LaHood, yes. Dr. Winstrup. Yes. Dr. Winstrup, yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington, yes. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson, yes. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, yes. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, yes. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn, yes. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller, yes. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy, yes. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, yes. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick, yes. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Stubbe, yes. Miss Tinney. Miss Tinney, yes. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, yes. Mrs. Steele. Mrs. Steele, yes. Miss Van Dyne. Miss Van Dyne, yes. Mr. Feenstra. Mr. Feenstra, yes. Miss Maliotakis. Miss Maliotakis, yes. Mr. Carey. Yes. Mr. Carey, yes. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, yes. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, yes. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Del Bene. Ms. Del Bene, yes. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, yes. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, yes. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, yes. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer, yes. Mr. Evans. Mr. Schneider. Mr. Schneider, yes. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, yes. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, yes. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Evans. Mr. Gomez.
How is Mr. Gomez recorded?
Mr. Gomez is not recorded. Mr. Gomez, yes. Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith, yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
The ayes are 40, the noes are 1.
There being 40 ayes and 1 no, the motion is agreed to, and H.R. 8292, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to H.R. 8292, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.